I'm going to take you on a fairly basic whistle-stop tour of how you might consider preparing for your first sim and maybe what the steps along the way are. I'm not going to get into anything terribly technical. It's really just a practical guide to how to go about it. So these are the basic steps. It looks like there's a lot of steps, but actually I've broken it down into really small bites, so it's more accessible. So the first thing you have to figure out is who are your target learners. This is an important consideration, and particularly in geriatric medicine, because we have quite a broad group of potential learners, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Once you have your target learners, you need to figure out what it is that you actually want them to learn. Because that's really important. That's what's going to guide your scenario development. The next thing is reaching out to the network that you are part of, and I'll talk a bit about that in a few minutes. Then there's a piece around preparing your learners for success. And I think this is really important because really and truly what you want is you want your learner to come in and thrive during the scenario. You know, you want to tip the balance in so far as you can in their favor, so that they're going to really enjoy it and really do well. The last thing you want is somebody coming out feeling disillusioned or embarrassed by what's happened. Having done that, you need to decide what modality you'll use. So are you going to go and do something inside in the resource room because you're trying to simulate a fast call, or maybe you're going to bring something into a more controlled environment like a sim lab where you can maybe focus on the communication side of things in a more controlled way. You need to plan how the scenario is going to progress, what resources you're going to need, and whose help you're going to seek along the way. You definitely need to plan how you're going to brief the learners on the day, and we have an entire talk on that this morning. You need to plan in advance what's going to be covered during your debrief, and Dara is going to take us through a good bit of detail on that also. And then you also need to have a little bit of a think about how you're going to evaluate your scenario, and I'll talk again about that in a few minutes. So just to go through these in a little bit of detail. So I suppose choosing your learners. So I suppose in gerontology, there's two groups of learners. There's the people who work with you every day, and they're experts, and they have one particular set of needs. They are a very interprofessional group. So some of them obviously are doctors like you guys, but obviously we work with all kinds of people, and their learning needs have to be considered when you're designing the simulation scenario. So they're one obvious set of learners. And then the second set of learners are people who don't realize that they are in fact our targets at the minute. These are the unsuspecting gerontologists. We all know that everybody in hospitals nowadays is actually a geriatrician, even if they don't yet fully realize it. And I suppose the reality is that you know, they've not benefited from any sort of specific training in geriatric medicine. They don't understand some of the basic fundamentals of care for older adults that you guys have been immersed in for the last few years. So they do require training, but aren't going to come to lectures. That's one thing for sure. So if we look at what they need, so the expert learners need quite a lot of different things, and they're going to access and use sim in lots of different ways. So they're going to want to explore higher order competencies. So, you know, really technical, complicated cases that they want to try and take on as a team and work together on. They're definitely going to want to work at interprofessional skills. So, you know, how well does the physiotherapist in the team work alongside the SPR or the occupational therapist or whatever? So that's something that you can really try and work on through simulation scenarios. They certainly also have an interest in developing transdisciplinary skills, and that's where you're asking somebody to maybe move a little bit outside of their normal scope of practice. So this would be, for example, expecting that an SPR in geriatric medicine may take on a basic mobility assessment that would be more conventionally performed by a physiotherapist. Well, you know, it's all well and good saying you're going to do that, but, you know, we're going to have to make sure that you're actually competent in it if that's what you're going to be doing. So it's about taking on skills that maybe aren't conventionally part of your role. Pathway testing and safety. So this is systems probing, and the guys in Galway have a lot of expertise in this and have started to use it in the integrated care teams there. And this is essentially testing pathways that either you are in the process of developing and you want to kind of run through them and see whether they do what you thought they were going to do, or else pathways that you presume to be working very, very well. But you can take them through a scenario and actually sometimes find that perhaps there are difficulties with that pathway that you haven't fully understood. So there's a very wide array of things that the experts around you would like to do with simulation. But obviously, when designing your scenarios for these, you need to bear in mind their expertise, and you can't be giving them basic, simple things because they just won't enjoy it and be of no value to them. On the other hand, the unsuspecting gerontologists, these require fundamentals. So they need to learn the fundamentals that they of looking after older adults that they can then take and apply to their own practice. So if they're a vascular surgeon, for example, what are the fundamentals they need in order to be able to look after their older cohort well? And actually, this is in fact the subject of 2 years of work for Emily, who's one of our MD students here, is that piece around trying to figure out what are those fundamentals that they need to know, and then which of them can we actually deliver via simulation. So I'm not going to get into that in any major detail because there's still almost a year's work to go on that particular project. The only part of my talk that's getting any way kind of technical is the deciding on your learning outcomes, because I guess if you haven't got clarity on your learning outcomes, the rest of the scenario doesn't really work after that. It doesn't flow. So you need to be quite clear on this. So what are learning outcomes? So learning outcomes are sets of competences expressing what the student will know, understand, or be able to do after you've completed your simulation. So they will be either cognitive things, so it'll be knowledge that they will have gained as a result of the simulation. It'll be psychomotor things like skills, procedures, or actions that they will have learned during the course of simulation, or it'll be affective skills, interest, attitude, values, communication, those kinds of things. So we certainly find ourselves, we're not doing a massive amount of skills-based simulation. We're more into the sort of the cognitive and the affective side. Learning outcomes focus on what the learner should achieve rather than the content of what will be taught. So, if you're doing a scenario on an assessment of a person with cognitive impairment, you're not really focusing on the diagnostic criteria and how they vary across different systems and that sort of thing. Instead, you want to be able to say that the student has applied valid diagnostic criteria and assessed the patient against those during the course of their simulation. It's important that the learning outcomes should be accessible. So there's no point writing a learning outcome if you can't actually determine whether or not the person did it in the middle of the sim. So you have to be able to write it and design it in such a way that if you're there as the facilitator, you can say, yes, they did it or they did not do it. And if they did it, how well they did it. So you need to write them in such a way that you can actually provide feedback on them afterwards. I'm not going to get into Bloom's taxonomy very much, in fact, at all, other than to say that it exists. And what this is for people who are writing learning outcomes, it is a way of being more precise about how you describe those learning outcomes. And again, the more precise you can be, the better the scenario will be afterwards. The taxonomy runs from at the bottom end, basic cognitive things like remembering, defining, listing, and then up at the top end, a sort of a creative level whereby people actually generate new ideas, new pathways, that sort of thing. We tend to find certainly that when we're doing sim with our expert learners, we live more at the top and at the upper end of complexity, up around the top end of Bloom's, and quite often get ideas for new projects or new pathways and that sort of thing. And it's unusual in teaching scenarios to get right up to the top of that taxonomy. But then obviously when we're targeting people outside of our own specialty, we tend to live more around the kind of the middle of the taxonomy there, trying to get them into sort of fundamental skills. Learning objectives in terms of how you describe them should be very specific. As I've said, they should be measurable. They should be achievable. So there is no point writing a learning objective for a 15-minute sim that's going to take an hour and a half to achieve. So it has to be achievable. It needs to be relevant to the person, and they need to feel as though this was an important thing to have learned. And it has to be time bound. So again, it's really important that you put down your objectives in a way that they can actually be delivered in the time allowed. That's the end of the sort of the technical side of things. The rest of it is more straightforward. The network piece. So what do I mean by this? Well, there's there's quite a bit of gerontological sim going on around the country at the minute. So on the left here, we have Maria Costello's group, along with Dara Byrne and the team in Galway, who are doing this sort of systems probing type of sim, where they're examining their pathways and simulating them to see how things might improve. We have teams from Cork who have, that's Pat Barry there, those of you who might be wondering, and you know, they've developed really good scenarios, and then we obviously have quite a few scenarios developed here as well. And I suppose what I mean by this is there's really no point reinventing the wheel. If you've decided that you want to target a particular set of learners and you've got a particular set of learning objectives, and if we already have a scenario designed for them and tested and refined, it doesn't make any sense that you would try to spend a few hours putting together another scenario for them. So I think we really need to work at trying to have a network, so that you guys can reach out and benefit from it. I suppose the question is, how do you develop a network, particularly if you're at the stage that you're at the minute, whereby you don't have anything? And in reality, simulation has kind of developed quite a momentum through social media, and probably particularly through Twitter. And even in the national simulation strategy, there is advice about how to disseminate your work, and it is important that your simulation activity is visible, because you'd be surprised how people start reaching out to you saying, oh, you know, we'd like to collaborate on a sim on you know, whatever. So so I think this is one of those situations where you just need to be you know, a little bit public about what it is that you're doing, because there are definite benefits. People do come to you. People like the National Simulation Office, I think, you know, and Dara being the lead now, will be very interested to see that somebody in Drogheda has started up you know, a small scale simulation effort, because that's something I'm sure that they would like to support. I have up there a list of the various Twitter pages that I tend to find that are the most active in this area and that are maybe of the most interest to geriatricians. It'll also explain why at times today you'll see me taking pictures and stuff, and they will leach their way onto the internet, I'm afraid. So preparing your learners for success. So I think it's important that you provide them with any advance. If you're going to be doing a complicated scenario, give them the information they need beforehand. It's up to them if they read it or not, but anything you can give them. If there's good videos you found online, if there's podcasts that you found that sort of particularly give them a good insight into what they're going to be doing, send it to them and let them access it before they come to the sim. Maria is going to talk about the pre-brief and the orientation, and then it's important that there's a bit of crack there as well. And certainly, you know, most of the sims, you know, things go wrong, and you just have to kind of embrace it and enjoy it. So I suppose when you've kind of identified your learning objectives, we then kind of engage in an exercise that's called storyboarding, and really this is an excuse just to get together for a cup of coffee. And what we do is we consider what the learning outcomes were. So we've got, in this scenario, we've only got 2 learning outcomes, but we have to design our scenario around those 2 learning outcomes. There's no point coming up with an idea for a sim if you haven't really planned it against learning outcomes, because you just get a random experience that doesn't really deliver that much. So we sit down and we begin to plan around those learning outcomes, and we have to make sure that as a group it feels credible. So if we bring particularly expert learners in, and if it feels incredible, if it just doesn't feel like this would happen in real life, then they don't engage with it. So we have to make sure that what we design makes sense. And this is often called the fidelity. Now, fidelity is a mixed word and has other meanings. I suppose the big tip that I would give you is, you know, think about a patient that you saw or that you're familiar with that had this particular presentation, because that's where you'll tend to achieve the greatest fidelity, is when you really just stick to a scenario that you already know. In terms of the agenda for this storyboarding meeting, we need to decide on the setting. So are we going to be doing this in the resus room? Is this a clinic-based scenario? Or are we going into the person's sitting room to assess them? You know, what sort of setting are we planning? The time frame, and the time frame is an important one because we can have more than one time frame. So in the scenario you do with us this evening, you're going to see 2 time frames. So we're going to meet once, and then we're going to fast forward time a week later, and we're going to have a second, a certain interaction. And that's something you can do in sim that you obviously can't do in real life. You can play with the timeframes. And if you're doing a stroke scenario, you can have CT results available instantly in a way that you couldn't have in real life. So the time frame is important to think about. And then the progression is really important, making sure that you've planned along the way how the scenario is going to start, what's going to happen in the middle. You really need to think about where the learner may go off piste. And again, you know, if it's a scenario you're familiar with, you'd be able to guess that pretty well. You need to have thought about how you're going to get them back on track again, and that's really important. In terms of the kind of preparation for it, you also need to have to think about the resources you're going to need, and you need to kind of keep this a bit local. So if I, you know, share a scenario with Emer, who's working in Tala at the moment, and if it's a stroke-based scenario, she can take the scenario, but realistically what she then needs to do, she needs to replace elements of the resources with Tala resources. So, you know, take the Waterford stroke pathway and replace it with the Tala one. Take the phone number for neuroradiology that we use here in Waterford, replace it with the Tala one. You know, so you have to make it local, but the main sort of learning and the scenario can still be the same. The embedded participants, so these are ESPs. These are the people who go in, and they're actually your supports during the sim, because as Emily will tell you, you know, once the sim starts, you've kind of lost control at that point. But the embedded participant still has an ability to change the course of what's happening. So if the learner is really struggling, they can provide them with a cue and remind them, oh, have you thought about asking about this, or have you thought about maybe doing that? You know, with proper sort of preparation and pre-planning, they will know when to come in with those cues. So they won't come in straight away. They won't sort of take the person immediately out of the awkward situation, but they will come in. And it's really important that they're well scripted and that they know in advance what it is they're expected to do. The debrief, I'm not going to talk about in any detail because Dara is far more qualified than I to do that. But I mean, at its essence, the debrief is really just in that conversation thinking, right, how are we going to make sure that these learning outcomes that we've planned are going to be the topics of discussion at the end? So we want to avoid a situation whereby we just end up talking about something completely random, and that we actually bring it back to what we intended to teach these people as part of it. And then the other thing about the debrief is it is a way to introduce you can bring in other learning outcomes at your debrief, so that's a possibility as well. I'm not going to talk about this at all, other than to say that there are ways to evaluate your sim. I mean, to be honest, if it's your first sim, you really just want to get some feedback from the people who participated in it. You know, did it feel real to them? What were the things they would change? That sort of stuff. If you're doing it a lot more within your team, you can start looking at whether or not your work is actually affecting the knowledge of your team members, whether the behaviors of your team members, and are they starting to work a bit better together, and whether or not you're starting to get actual clinical outcomes from it all. That's sort of, that's the sort of stuff that you could probably do within your team, but it's a pretty organized effort and not something you're going to be doing from your first sim. Organizing your thoughts. We're going to give you, there are many templates out there for writing a scenario. We're going to give you a copy of our one. Dara has one in the National Simulation Strategy. I guess ours is written with geriatricians in mind, so it's maybe just an easier one to use. But to be honest, once you use one and become familiar with it, it's fine. I mean, this is the basic headings. There's the scenario title, there's a brief abstract, so that if I'm sharing it with somebody, they can read that briefly and say, well, does this match what I wanted to do or not? The target learners are specified in it. What's going to be covered during the pre-brief is there. The learning outcomes, obviously, any desired background knowledge. So this is the stuff that you're going to have given them in advance. Where is the scenario situated? Who's going to be in there? And we would always, so today is a bit artificial. Your scenario this afternoon is just one learner and one discipline. But generally speaking, we would have two learners and two disciplines in there. So it's being quite clear as to who those roles are. The resources required, so this is props and radiology results, CT images, basically anything you can think of that might be needed. Drug cardexes if they're going to be needed, hospital charts, all of those kinds of things. You then run through the scenario progression, and we'll do this afternoon in the workshop exercise, where you run through step by step what's going to happen in this scenario. Roughly how long do we think that's going to take? If the person isn't progressing on to the next step, what is the cue they're going to need from the participant who's in there to kind of move them along and keep them going along the track. And then obviously we plan what's going to be discussed during the debrief. We put in always some sort of note as to how we're going to evaluate the scenario, and then we provide patient scripts, candidate information sheets, and then an information sheet for your ESP. Why bother with the template? Well, I suppose the first thing is, having had maybe one or two of these kind of storyboarding meetings, what it does do then is it brings a bit of order on those conversations, and in a structured way that's quite predictable. Importantly, it allows you to refine the scenario. So, for example, the scenario that we're running this afternoon, we ran a dry round of it yesterday, and we've made a few refinements to the scenario as a result of that. And because the document is there, it's just a case of going in and sort of tweaking the document, and it's not a big deal to be able to do it. It allows you to reproduce it. So you'd be surprised how quickly, it's like anything, you forget what it is that you did in the scenario. And if next year you've got a new set of trainees and a new set of staff, the last thing you want is to have to write the scenario again. So having it all documented inside in your template means you can just simply do it again next year without the same level of effort that was needed the first term round. And of course, it means that you can share. So, if somebody wants to actually just take it on and do it themselves in another situation and another location, then you can just send it to them. You will have detected from the talk that there's a bit of work in developing these documents, and what I would say is, while they are excellent and they are really important, sometimes you can do sim on the back of an envelope, and I hope Dara's not listening right now, but when you're starting out, done is better than perfect. It is better to plan a scenario, do it, and just get a bit of experience at it. And if you don't have a whole load of documents that you can use to disseminate afterwards and all that sort of stuff, that's not a big deal. You still did a scenario, you still did a bit of teaching, and you built up your own experience. And that's very much how we all started out with it as well. So while the templates are brilliant and you should be using them, don't let that be an impediment to doing your first sim either.